The evening sun begins its slow descent over the red brick facades of central London, casting long, dramatic shadows across the mall, yet the heavy air carries a tension that has very little to do with the summer heat. For over half a decade, a single agonizing question has hovered over the British monarchy like an unresolved chord, a persistent murmur of speculation that has filled countless column inches and dominated late-night broadcasts. It is the question of the king's second son, a prince who chose a distant shore but whose shadow continues to lengthen across the ancient stones of his birthplace, creating an almost permanent state of administrative and emotional anxiety. For 6 long years, the public has watched a delicate, exhausting game of diplomatic chess play out in real time, defined by a constant, agonizing rhythm of will he or won't he? Maybe he will, or maybe he simply cannot. It was a cycle of endless hesitation, a period of profound dithering where the highest echelons of the palace seemed trapped in a loop of extending olive branches, only to watch them wither under the glare of public recrimination. This long era of institutional indecision, which many critics argue has severely eroded the traditional authority and historic credibility of the crown, appeared to be an inescapable reality of modern royal life. But on this extraordinary Monday, under the pressure of a fast-moving sequence of events that caught even seasoned courtiers entirely off guard, that prolonged era of hesitation came to an abrupt, definitive, and earth-shattering halt. To fully understand how this dramatic climax unfolded, one must first appreciate the surreal atmosphere that gripped the entire nation just hours before the storm broke. The British public had risen that morning entirely exhausted, bleary-eyed from a night of wild, shared adrenaline that had kept millions glued to their television screens until the early hours of the morning. It was a night when ordinary life was suspended as England battled Mexico in a thrilling, high-stakes World Cup match that pushed deep into the nocturnal hours, not reaching its conclusion until nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. Even those who normally claim absolute indifference to the beautiful game found themselves swept up in the collective hysteria of a nation celebrating a hard-fought victory that propelled their team into the coveted quarterfinals. The sensory overload was universal, extending even to the highest ranks of the royal family itself, where Prince William, known to be absolutely football mad, took to social media at 4 a.m. to post a highly personal message of congratulations signed simply with his initial. As the sports commentators spoke with raw, hoarse voices on the morning news, the rest of the kingdom attempted to shake off a profound lack of sleep, completely unaware that a much larger institutional drama was already brewing behind closed palace doors. If you want to stay ahead of these rapidly unfolding stories and understand the true mechanics behind the headlines as they happen, please take a brief moment to hit the subscribe button below and join our community. It was precisely amid this collective exhaustion, around mid-morning, that the digital landscape erupted with a series of frantic, high-priority notifications that sent shockwaves through newsrooms across London. Initial reports carried with absolute confidence by major national broadcasters, including the BBC, delivered a piece of news that seemed utterly unfathomable given the bitter history of recent years. The headlines boldly declared that Prince Harry had officially arrived in the capital and, in an astonishing twist of apparent reconciliation, was set to take up residence within the historic walls of Buckingham Palace itself. To those who have closely followed the deep structural fractures within the House of Windsor, this announcement felt less like a genuine news report and more like a bizarre hallucination brought on by a severe lack of sleep. The idea that King Charles had suddenly caved, reversing years of strategic distancing to allow his estranged son back into the literal and symbolic heart of the monarchy, felt entirely inconsistent with everything we knew about the current court. For a brief, chaotic window of about 5 minutes, the world watched in absolute disbelief, assuming that the long-running family feud had miraculously dissolved into a sudden act of patriarchal forgiveness. Yet, this narrative of a peaceful homecoming was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, a highly confident projection from a specific public relations office that was about to collide violently with reality. What the public was witnessing was not an organized royal reception, but the opening salvo of a brutal high-stakes public relations war that would expose just how deep the bitterness runs between a father and his son. The illusion vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, shattered by a counter-offensive from the palace press office that was unprecedented in its speed, its directness, and its absolute lack of traditional royal ambiguity. In a move that signaled a permanent shift in strategy, officials did not merely issue a polite, vague denial. Instead, they dropped a detailed bombshell statement that systematically dismantled the Sussex narrative line by line. The palace revealed an extraordinary level of logistical detail, explicitly stating that an offer of accommodation had indeed been extended to the prince well over a week in advance, providing ample opportunity for a dignified arrangement. Courtiers had set a strict deadline of Friday afternoon for a formal response, a boundary designed to allow the extensive palace staff sufficient time to prepare a secure and suitable environment for the visiting royal. Yet, according to the palace's remarkably candid timeline, that deadline passed in absolute silence, leaving the king's administrators entirely in the dark about the prince's actual intentions. It was only over the weekend that a chaotic sequence of digital communications began to unfold, with the prince reportedly declining the offer in writing, only to abruptly reverse his decision hours later as the working week drew near. By the time Monday morning arrived, the prince reportedly attempted to bypass the administrative apparatus entirely, operating with an attitude of all guns blazing, confidently assuming that the grand gates of Buckingham Palace would swing open on his command. But the king's patience, built upon decades of endurance and tested by a relentless stream of public grievances, had finally reached its absolute, irreversible limit. The sudden and sharp rejection from Buckingham Palace marked a historic turning point, a moment where the invisible machinery of the monarchy stopped accommodating the perpetual uncertainty surrounding the Duke of Sussex. To understand the gravity of this refusal, one must look past the polite architectural excuses and examine the sheer scale of the building that had suddenly closed its doors to a son of the sovereign. Buckingham Palace is not merely an office. It is a sprawling, monumental fortress of royal history boasting well over 700 individual rooms, including dozens of fully appointed principal bedrooms and extensive guest quarters. While it is true that massive multi-year renovation projects are currently underway across several wings, and many of the majestic state apartments are routinely prepared for public tours or formal diplomatic events, the estate remains a massive, fully staffed operational powerhouse. There is no logistical reality in which a house of that magnitude, supported by a dedicated army of domestic staff, chefs, and security personnel, could not rapidly prepare a single suite for a visiting prince if the master of the house truly desired it. The reality of that chaotic Monday morning was far simpler and infinitely more devastating for the family dynamic. King Charles had quite simply run out of patience. For years, the king's allies and advisors have operated under a policy of extreme de-escalation, desperately trying to lower the public temperature, maintain a dignified silence, and avoid engaging in a destructive briefing war that only serves to diminish the crown. But the events of this week forced a dramatic departure from that long-standing strategy, resulting in a coordinated, highly intentional wave of briefings from the king's closest allies that exposed the raw frustration at the heart of the court. This firm, unyielding stance, taken by the palace authorities, carries a striking, almost haunting resemblance to the infamous Sandringham Summit, a pivotal moment in recent history that remains a bitter memory for all parties involved. Back then, as the family attempted to negotiate the terms of a royal departure, a series of minor administrative hurdles were used as polite, face-saving barriers to mask a profound institutional refusal. In his own memoirs, Prince Harry recounted a frustrating moment where he was told that the palace printers had suddenly broken down or run completely out of paper, an excuse that prevented him from presenting alternative organizational options to his grandmother. It was a classic example of the British establishment's preference for a gentle white lie, an off-ramp designed to save blushes and maintain decorum while firmly enforcing a royal decree that had already been decided at the very top. Today, we are seeing the exact same tactical blueprint being deployed, as the King's side attempts to provide a logistical narrative about staff courtesy and unprepared rooms to soften the blow of a deliberate, calculated locked door. Yet, the palace did not rely solely on household logistics to justify this extraordinary move. They also introduced a fascinating, highly complex argument involving the highest levels of the British legal system. Courtiers pointed directly to a major High Court judgment scheduled to be handed down on Tuesday afternoon, a legal decision stemming from the prince's ongoing, highly contentious battles regarding his status and security. The king's advisors argued with immense force that it would be profoundly inappropriate for the prince to reside within the sovereign's official home at the exact moment this critical judicial decision was made public. The palace feared that the Duke would inevitably use the iconic, globally recognized iconography of Buckingham Palace as a dramatic, highly symbolic backdrop for his immediate public response. Had the judgment been favorable, the palace anticipated a triumphant victory lap, a public declaration where the prince would position himself as a heroic dragon slayer who had successfully forced the hand of a stubborn establishment. Conversely, had the decision gone against him, advisors feared he would use the steps of the royal residence to proclaim himself the ultimate victim of a ghastly, calculated establishment stitch-up orchestrated by pale, male and stale courtiers. For a king who sits at the absolute apex of the nation's judicial and constitutional system, the prospect of his official residence being dragged into a private civil dispute was an administrative nightmare that could not be tolerated. The Sussex camp, however, was quick to spot the inherent contradictions in this legal argument, launching an immediate and ferocious counter-offensive through their own media channels that sent tensions spiraling to dangerous new heights. Sources close to the California-based royals pointed out that the official date for the High Court judgment had been formally announced the previous Thursday, meaning the palace had full knowledge of the timeline long before the weekend began. If the looming legal decision was truly the driving factor behind the accommodation refusal, the offer should logically have been rescinded days earlier, rather than being left to create a frantic last-minute crisis on a Monday morning. Instead of quietly de-escalating the situation, the Sussex communications team chose to go completely nuclear, releasing a lengthy, emotionally charged statement that accused the palace of manufacturing a cynical pretext. They suggested that the original invitation to stay at the royal residence was never sincere to begin with, characterizing it as a sophisticated, deeply manipulative trap designed to humiliate the prince on arrival. This escalating warfare between the two press offices created a surreal atmosphere across London, just as Prince Harry's private charter flight touched down in the capital early Monday evening. As the prince stepped out into the damp British air, entirely alone without the company of his wife or children, he found himself a geopolitical nomad in his own hometown, forced to seek shelter in an undisclosed central London hotel or with private friends. The tension hanging over the capital was palpable as the media apparatuses of both sides continued to trade heavy blows, ensuring that what was supposed to be a quiet, charitable visit had transformed into an institutional crisis of the highest order. This public display of rancor has exposed a profound structural weakness in how the royal family handles its internal fractures, revealing an operation that is stretched to its absolute breaking point. Observers have noted with a mixture of amusement and horror that a 41-year-old prince is now reduced to conducting sensitive, high-stakes accommodation negotiations directly via chaotic weekend emails with individual palace managers. This chaotic, disorganized approach to international travel and state-level security stands in stark, unflattering contrast to the highly disciplined, flawless public appearances of the working members of the royal family. On the very same day that this bitter briefing war was tearing through the headlines, King Charles was photographed miles away in Dorset, completely detached from the domestic drama, driving a massive Challenger tank during a live firing exercise. The image of the 77-year-old monarch, helmet strapped on tightly and sunglasses firmly in place as heavy ordnance boomed across the military ranges, sent an unmistakable symbolic message to the world. It was a vivid, powerful demonstration of a sovereign focused entirely on his duties as head of state, purposefully drawing a thick, unyielding line between the serious business of the crown and the exhausting, self-inflicted drama of his younger son. The stark contrast between a king commanding military armor in the British countryside and a prince navigating the cold realities of a London hotel room represents the true, tragic depth of the modern royal schism. This final dramatic breakdown in communication is not merely a temporary logistical misunderstanding. It is a profound institutional turning point that leaves the future of several major charitable endeavors hanging in absolute uncertainty. At the very center of this brewing storm is the Invictus Games, an extraordinary internationally revered sporting event that was originally co-founded by Prince Harry alongside his brother and their dedicated team of advisors. For over a decade, this magnificent charity has served as a beacon of hope, resilience, and genuine inspiration for thousands of wounded, injured, and sick service personnel across the globe, transforming countless lives through the power of sport. Yet, as the Duke of Sussex prepares to launch a series of high-profile promotional events in London to mark 1 year until the next major games, his chaotic personal life threatens to completely overshadow the achievements of the veterans. Seasoned commentators and charity administrators are beginning to wonder openly how much longer this marvelous organization can afford to remain bound to an individual whose public profile has become so intensely polarizing. The corporate sponsors and major international donors, who are absolutely vital for funding the massive operational costs of these global games, are notoriously risk-averse entities that demand absolute stability and positive public association. These multi-billion-dollar conglomerates look at the current landscape and see a prince who is locked in a bitter, unyielding conflict with the head of state, frequently accusing the monarchy of duplicity, institutional racism, and systemic cruelty. For an organization like Invictus, which relies heavily on the goodwill of governments, defense ministries, and mainstream corporate backing, alignment with a figure who publicly brands the king a liar is becoming an unsustainable institutional liability. To make matters infinitely worse, the Sussex communication strategy over the preceding weeks had reached a level of desperate escalation that deeply unsettled the British public and the security apparatus alike. In a frantic attempt to pressure the British state into granting him automatic taxpayer-funded armed protection, the prince's legal and public relations teams took the extraordinary step of leaking highly sensitive documents to national broadcasters. Among these leaks was a confidential threat assessment compiled by his own private security advisors, which explicitly claimed that the prince faced an elevated, imminent risk of a high-level terrorist attack during his public appearances in London. This reckless dissemination of terror warnings was viewed by many security experts as a transparent, deeply manipulative attempt to use fear as a political lever to force a policy change from the Home Office. By painting a picture of imminent bloodshed at a major charitable event, the Sussex camp was effectively suggesting that any future security failure would be the direct moral fault of a pedantic and unfeeling British government. This strategy completely backfired, alienating the very authorities whose cooperation the prince desperately requires, and generating a profound sense of anger among ordinary citizens who view the rules of royal security as entirely fair. The established regulations regarding state-funded bodyguards are remarkably simple and consistently applied across the United Kingdom. Automatic. Armed protection is strictly reserved for working members of the royal family who officially represent the Crown and reside permanently within the country. Since the Duke of Sussex voluntarily chose to step back from his official duties and relocate his entire commercial operation to a multi-million-dollar estate in California over half a decade ago, he ceased to qualify for this elite tier of public protection. The palace, supported by a vast majority of the public, has firmly maintained that while the prince undoubtedly faces risks, those risks are no greater than those faced by prominent politicians or global celebrities who must fund their own private security arrangements. This long, exhausting dispute over security and status has ultimately served as the catalyst for the king's final, historic loss of patience, a moment of profound personal and constitutional reckoning for the aging monarch. For 3 long years since ascending the throne, King Charles has attempted to balance the immense, unyielding responsibilities of the crown with the deeply painful, enduring instincts of a loving father. He has consistently left the door to reconciliation slightly ajar, frequently enduring intense criticism from his closest advisors and his eldest son, Prince William, who have long advocated for a policy of absolute, unyielding exile. It was the king's deeply forgiving nature that led him to extend the original invitation for his son to stay at Buckingham Palace, a gesture of immense generosity that was met not with gratitude, but with late-night legal bickering and media manipulation. Now, under the immense weight of his historic responsibilities and the visible decline of the monarchy's overall popularity ratings, the king appears to have experienced his own definitive road to Damascus moment. This profound shift in attitude mirrors the decisive, ruthless manner in which the king eventually handled his own brother, Prince Andrew. Removing his financial support and severing his official ties to the institution when his public scandals threatened to permanently damage the credibility of the throne. For King Charles, the realization has finally set in that the survival of the 1,000-year-old institution he represents must take absolute precedence over the emotional desires of an estranged son or the natural wish to see his distant grandchildren. As the Duke of Sussex navigates his 2-week stay in the United Kingdom, travelling to historic family estates like Althorp and relying on the hospitality of a diminishing circle of aristocratic friends, he does so as a profoundly isolated figure. The grand, unyielding fortress of Buckingham Palace stands as a silent, monumental testament to a boundary that has finally been drawn in the ancient soil of Britain, a line that will not be crossed until a profound, genuine apology is offered. Prince William emerges from this chaotic week as the ultimate, undeniable victor, his long-standing, uncompromising strategy of zero tolerance toward public betrayal completely validated by his father's sudden, firm enforcement of royal discipline. The era of royal dithering, of extending endless olive branches